Can I ask everyone to please find a seat? We'll get the program started in just a moment. They pay attention. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Good evening. I'm John Mika, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Civil War Roundtable. The Legacy Foundation, as you all know, is the nonprofit charity of the Union League. We use the history, the values, and the spirit of this great institution, the Union League of Philadelphia, for all sorts of programs, civics education, scholarships, and lectures like tonight, and exhibits. And I'll tell you a little bit about our next exhibit in just a moment. So tonight's program will run about an hour. We will have Q&A at the end of the program. We are streaming live, so I'm going to ask you to do two things. One, please silence your cell phones. And two, when you ask a question, and we will moderate the questions, please use the microphone so we can hear you when we're streaming the program. So we have a series of wonderful programs coming up. This is really the start of our programming year. On October 3rd, we have our first Liberty Series program with Bob Woodson. Bob is some of you probably have seen him on TV. He's a wonderful person. He's a civil rights leader that goes back to the 60s and 70s. He's a businessman, an entrepreneur, and a defender of American ideals and values. And he will be here for a program, Race, Poverty, and the Crisis in America. It promises to be a compelling and entertaining, because I've talked to Bob a couple times, program. We will be opening our next exhibit down in the Hewer Room in the Heritage Center. It will be Philadelphia and the Civil War, which makes a lot of sense for us. And it'll be through our eyes, the eyes of the Union League of Philadelphia. Every piece, or every archival piece, object, piece of paper will be from our collection. And I'm certain that some of these pieces you have not seen before. So that'll open on October 19th. On October 24th, we have Kathy Orcutt for a library hour, Power and Posterity, Art at the Centennial. So I'm sure you'll want to see that as well. All these programs and all the other programs that we do are made possible through generous contributions from our members. And I thank all of you who support us. For those of you that don't yet, I hope you will, and you will have that opportunity as we start our fundraising year. And the man who's most responsible from a volunteer perspective for raising that money is my good friend, the chair of the Development Committee, and he is here to introduce our program. Where is Dr. Gary Dorsheimer? Gary.
Thank you, John. Good evening and welcome tonight. It's my privilege to introduce this evening's speaker. A lifelong resident of the Philadelphia area, Mike Jesberger is an independent military historian who specializes in the American Revolutionary and Civil War time periods. He is renowned for his engaging and passionate presentation style, which we hope that you'll rate tonight, whether providing formal lectures, living history presentations, or tours of historic sites. After years of study and research, in 1996, he joined a Civil War Historical Association, the recreated Company C, 28th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. That same year, he also joined the Anna M. Ross Camp No. 1, Department of Pennsylvania, Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. You have to be engaging to go through all those titles there. In 2000, Mr. Jesberger became a member of the recreated 1st New Jersey Regiment, goes across the river too, like some other people have crossed, of the Continental Line, a Revolutionary War reenacting unit, and serves as current president of that organization. In 2002, he was appointed to the Langhorne Revolutionary War Burial Site Committee and serves as a current board member. Still active in the reenacting community, he participates in dozens of battle reenactments, living history programs, and ceremonies to honor veterans. So I think he's going to bring some history alive to us tonight, and please help me welcome Mr. Jesberger.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And John and Kira, thank you for everything, the hospitality, and really looking forward to it. I have long been part of the Lincoln Day Parade ceremony as a reenactor, so I've been here, but not in a suit and tie. So that's a little bit of a change of pace. It is really great to be here as we look at the program tonight. West Point classmates of the American Civil War. Before I start every program with a sincere, heartfelt thank you. Any veteran, the spouse of a veteran, it's important we always continue to do that. And tonight we're going to talk about some of our first and earliest veterans that wore both blue and gray, both sides. It's important that we remember our veterans. It's great to be out and about again, doing public presentations and reenactments, and you're often reminded of the innocence and how much people love history. Certainly an organization like this, rich in history, in Philadelphia is important. And we live in an amazing location regionally of Revolutionary War and Civil War history. In July, I was at the Constitution Center. We did a reenactment over 3 days on the front lawn. There were people from around the world and the country coming to Philadelphia, and we were doing a colonial impression on the front lawn. What a better front lawn to have a camp. And the great thing about that, as you'll learn here in the next half hour, 45 minutes, I love to talk history. So at a place like that, you're guaranteed public. They come off the bus, they come in from the airport, they come to Philadelphia to see our history. So I was standing there on an afternoon, finishing up the day in a colonial uniform, when a family of 4 came up, and the father got off the bus, and he looked one way, and he goes, Independence Hall, Liberty Bell, taking pictures left and right, Constitution Center, and he saw us in uniform, and he came up and he was asking some really good questions. And then he had his son, about an 8-year-old, and the little boy looked at me with that inquisitive look, and he's looking at me, and he says, do you really know George Washington? We're in Philadelphia, do you have a direct connection to it? And I said, no, this is what we do. I mean, we love history. I have a real job, 9 to 5, and I enjoy what I do on weekends. And he says, I have a question. And almost as soon as the little boy said it, the father off to the side is like cutting him off. I said, no, what's the question? And the little boy looks at me with that inquisitive look, and he says, do you happen to know what George Washington's favorite type of tree would be? So I said, it wasn't the cherry tree, you chopped it down. I'm thinking about it, I put the history hat on, and I said, well, oak would be solid, and I'm going oak, cedar, pine, and the father's like, no. He goes, trust me, you're not going to get it. And I said, no, I'm going to go with oak. And the little boy looks at me and he says, George Washington's favorite type of tree was infantry. Night. He said he's been waiting to use that in 4 other cities, and I bought it. Again, Civil War, West Point classmates, brothers in tradition, enemies engaged in battle. Their loyalty and their devotion was to a code of honor that tore through the very fabric of their being. The institution they loved, West Point, the United States Military Academy. The motto of West Point, duty, honor, country. These were West Point classmates. Among the tens of thousands of soldiers that fought for the North and the South, some of them we remember, and I listed only a few. I'm only focusing on the Civil War. I know there's quite a few other big boys not on here. Maybe that's a part 2 but tonight, if you look, I think some of them may surprise you if you didn't know some of them, whose names we do remember. They came through the point with various backgrounds, different religions. These men made up a unique group. A group of men that had something in common, something particular. The military training they had received at this elite school was first and foremost, yes. But it was in this institution that these young men were transformed from young boys to men, from citizens to soldiers. They had a common bond that started almost as immediately upon their entry into the point. As cadets, their trials would be through battle and the death that was waged upon on those bloody battlefields. Only through their incredible military professionalism that war had been waged upon could it bring an end. The West Pointers represented the pinnacle of that concept of military professionalism. They never forgot that they were all Americans and that West Point taught them that. Great thing about tonight's program is, unlike the Revolutionary War, I can actually show you some photos. And just a couple of times tonight, I'm going to quote some of these actual cadets. One of my favorites is a gentleman by the name of Morris Schaff. He's going to talk to us tonight. This is what he says, quote, "There are two West Points, the actual West Point and the overarching spiritual one. One only becomes familiar with the second one when he graduates. He hears no voice, but there is communicated to him in some way a presence of an invisible authority, and it talks to us throughout," end quote. Morris Schaff, class of 1862. Now, the first West Point, the actual institution, where I'm sure many of you have visited, or maybe we even have a graduate here, is easy to find. It's located about 50 miles north of New York City, and since 1802, it has been the home of the United States Military Academy. And on the second Saturday in December, the best football team in the planet. Go Army, beat Navy. I don't know how we lost last year. I still have no idea how we lost. And actually, I know, I'm not bragging, but they beat Villanova last weekend, so. That's been a family tradition. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, we put the Christmas tree up on Army-Navy Day. There are three amazing stories of the history of West Point, and the history is so long we could have a whole symposium here, but we're not going to do that. The second West Point, the one that Morris told us about, the second one is the spiritual one. It's intangible among the West Pointers. It exudes more than anything else a strong spirit and a brotherly love and affection and comradeship. None of the cadets that entered West Point expected to die fighting each other during our American Civil War. But the comradeship that they built up enabled them to stay together and enabled many of the cadets to somehow get through those 4 years, the darkest days of our country. And the comradeship would survive the war as well. At West Point, it was said that there was a strong feeling of belonging to an entity that defies rational analysis, which creates a true sense of male bonding. It's created and formed some type of mystique, and it was very powerful and very effective for these men throughout those 4 years. The bonding that created the spirit became almost immediately upon their admission to the Institute. That's not always easy. To gain acceptance to the academy, the prospective cadet had to obtain an elusive appointment that was assigned to each U.S. congressman. You only got one. One of the more interesting appointments to West Point was in the 1840s, and is a fine example of how ingenious and determined a cadet may be to gain acceptance into West Point. So, for example, this gentleman. There's too many cadets in Virginia looking for admission. So George Pickett moves to Illinois. And he knows that in Illinois, there's an old Virginia congressman, and that's who he hits up to give him his admission. Anybody know who it is? That would be Abraham Lincoln. Can you imagine? On that July 3rd, 1863, if Lincoln knew he was giving Pickett a letter into West Point, that's how Pickett gets in. That's how he gets in. The standards of admission were straightforward and simple. That's because education was not universal as it is today. And at the time in the United States, they wanted to give what they called the unlearned an equal opportunity to prove themselves in the Institute. And one of these unlearned was a plain young man from the backwoods of Virginia. Thomas Jackson, later known as the Stonewall, the brilliant Confederate general. He was probably one of the most poorly prepared cadets to ever step foot into West Point. And the only way he passed was his enthusiasm and his sincerity that got him into the point. The bonding became more intense as the young soldiers trained and grew together, learned together, lived together. And they start to realize it right away. Again, here's one for you. This is one of my favorites. Quote, "You can't imagine how much spirited I feel today since I acquitted myself very handsomely this morning at drill. It's strange and different how these little circumstances can change somebody. Before the drill, I felt in low spirits and was very disappointed. I was homesick. And I doubt my competency to get through this place. But now, after drill, I feel much, much different. And how different a man can feel." End quote. That's George Mcclellan. The curriculum was very demanding and rigid. The classes taught were rigorous and the dropout rate extremely high. The courses were not what was taught in the universities in the cities. They were much different. They were engineering, drawing, languages, all kinds of math. Very, very heavy influence on math. They also taught, of course, military tactics from the best the world ever produced. They learned gunnery, artillery, a newer science, all goes together. And they learned how to be a soldier from the ground up, not just mentally, but also on the field and among each other. They learned from one of the more notable gentlemen of the time, Dennis Hart Mahan. He wanted the cadets to emulate Napoleon's Grand Army, but they're 18, 19-year-olds. They had some work to do. But Hart Mahan was very, very much focusing on what he learned from his studies of military tactics. And he learns and he studies Napoleon. So he starts to emulate. Remember, this is before the Civil War. So he tells the cadets the main focus is speed, and military operations and logistics, something that many armies haven't really considered. And at the heart of all the study was a clear, defined purpose of the cadets' role. The first intention of West Point was, yes, to graduate cadets for future studies and future military roles. But really, what they were trying to build was men of great character. Men of great character. That was important. And also skill, but skill could be learned. And that's something that early on they struggled with. And you'll see this shortly. Some of the examples. The importance of character was rigorously enforced by the strict code of conduct, a very strict code of conduct at West Point. Many of the cadets who went through West Point would earn demerits for their numerous indiscretions. It was almost like high school, folks. They were giving them out left and right. So for these breach of regulations, a penalty would be administered, called a form of a demerit. And a specific soldier, cadet, tells us about it. This is what he tells us. Quote, "They give a man one of these black marks, or demerits, as they call them, for almost nothing. If he gets 200 a year, they will dismiss him. To show how easy one can get one of these marks, a cadet got 8 of these marks yesterday for not going to church. He was put under arrest, so he could not leave his room for a month. All this for not going to church?" End quote. Ulysses S. Grant. So, like we did the half hour before among each other, socialize, get together, gather, they did too. And they were under some really, really intense pressure. So, at the risk of accumulating even more and more demerits, they risked it, but it was worth it. They said it was worth it. They went and sought relief at an off-campus tavern called Benny Havens. Folks, look at that walkway to Benny Havens. That's an original photo of the tavern. This would be a very, very famous pastime and place to visit for future President Jefferson Davis. Davis, in fact, was court-martialed once for being caught off duty at Benny Havens. And on one occasion, Jefferson Davis got so drunk, he basically almost killed himself falling down that hill. He lost his footing and went rolling down. He broke several bones, and Jefferson Davis compiled so many demerits that he graduated very, very low in his class. But conduct was always a part of the class. This is West Point. This is similar to the Naval Academy. This is the epicenter of our military training. So of course conduct's important, but it's fun when you read about them, these young boys. So demerits and conduct would play a very large role in your final rank when you graduate. But your graduation rank is not always an indicator of what you're going to do in life. And you can kind of take that into anything, right? I mean, Ulysses S. Grant, for example, was not the best student. He would end up 21 out of 39. Our future president, Ulysses S. Grant. He was very good at math, but math was only a part of it. He was good at drawing, and it was said he was one of the finest horsemen at the point. But otherwise, like everything in Grant's life, it was hard for him. And I think maybe that was why he was so constant in pursuing throughout his life. On the other hand, number 2 out of 59, General George Mcclellan, the Union general who seemed to never have enough men and could never end the war when he had a chance. 2nd out of 59, McClellan was an example of the intellect that learns, but the character that does not deliver. You see this time and time again throughout all military history. Wrong leaders in the wrong place at the wrong time. These men could be useful staff officers. You ever watch Band of Brothers? There's all kinds of men that lead armies and it turns into a disaster. Then you have one particular student whose ranking would foreshadow the greatness that was to come. The legendary commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, some argue the best army the country ever produced, Robert E. Lee, the exemplary cadet model of West Point. Never had one demerit. It's unheard of. It's impossible. Not one single demerit. No one thought he could do it. Nobody thought it was possible. But he did it. Lee would also become superintendent of West Point in the 1850s. As the secession arises, Lee reminded the Corps of Cadets at West Point that they were a band of brothers. And that band would reach the breaking point on the eve of the American Civil War. West Point reflected the political and social complexion of America itself. So when the country began to come apart in the late 1850s after John Brown's raid and some say an election, perhaps no other group of cadets reflected the nation's divisions as sharply as the classes at West Point in May and June of 1861. 2 classes. One would graduate 6 weeks earlier. So the class that would have graduated in 1862 was allowed to graduate 6 weeks later, thus confusing historians for the rest of time. These men were loyal to each other, and it's all they ever knew. Perhaps no other group would see anything like this at West Point. These men were friends, they were comrades. They were also sharing political differences, but they were all Americans. Every one of them was, and they had different beliefs. Nothing had really come to a boiling point yet. The most noteworthy difference, and these differences started to turn violent in 61, was documented that took place at West Point. It was between Emory Upton and Wade Hampton Gibbs, a cadet from South Carolina. Morris Schaff is back, our young cadet who's talking to us tonight. This is Morris Schaff. He tells us, quote, "It was the most thrilling event I've ever seen in my life. as the cadets went toe to toe. It was the most significant engagement at West Point. It was very real. It was national and prophetic because this fight duly represented the issue between the states, end quote, Morris Schaff. The two cadets fought it out. There was no victor. There was no loser. They both stood there, beaten, battered, bleeding. But what changed and what was different about this fight is nobody shook hands. It was clear that this fight represented the tensions that were growing. Tensions would grow even further as the southern states began to secede from the Union. Whether to remain loyal to the Union or to the United States government, or to give up their careers as cadets and future officers in the American Army and go home, meant go south. A very tortuous decision for many. These officers that were serving as regular Army at West Point, they too would have to make a decision. West Point has taught them that duty was the essence of an officer and a gentleman. But now the question is duty, yes, but to who? Who do I follow? Is it the duty to the United States of America? Is it duty to the nation? Is it duty to the Army? Is it duty to Virginia or South Carolina or Georgia? Is it duty to my family, who has done everything they could to get me here? Is it duty to the flag? If so, which flag? It's terrible that these young cadets had to be put through that and make a decision, but such is West Point. John Pelham, class of 1861, tells us this, quote, "It would be exceedingly gratifying to me and my whole family to receive a diploma from this institution, but yet fate now seemed to have willed it otherwise. I don't see any honorable course. I don't see anything other than tendering my resignation when Alabama leaves the Union, and I will offer my services to her," end quote. At least one decisive cadet sought guidance from an officer, a Louisiana native, and at one time superintendent of West Point named Pierre G.T. Beauregard from Louisiana. The cadet comes up to Beauregard and says, quote, "Should I resign now, or should I wait for my state to secede?" Beauregard looks over his shoulder and is reported to have said, quote, "Well, watch me jump, and when I jump, you jump." Stories leaked out about Southern officers saying this back to Washington, and Beauregard was relieved properly at that announcement. There was so much deep emotion running through the point, and you start to see it when it became inevitable of these decisions that had to be made, and very difficult decisions had to be made. They're beautiful. As the Union starts to crumble, many of the cadets start to go home. Morris Schaff is back. Quote, let me back up a second. He's talking about the farewell with his roommate from Georgia, who he'd been with from day one. "He threw his arms around me and we began to sob. 'God bless you, Morris. Farewell, dear John.' He then soon disappeared down the roadway leading to the river landing. A small ferry boat set out for the garrison, and I soon saw a figure way in the distance waving a white handkerchief. I fluttered mine, and I don't know if he saw it, and the little colors of his uniform floated down the river. I wondered if I should ever have such a close friend again," end quote. Well, the cadets are saying their farewells, and the academy knows they're in trouble. In an effort to keep the remaining cadets from resigning, the school made a poignant observance of Washington's birthday in 1861, February 22nd. This was a climactic moment in many ways at West Point. The cadets were marched to chapel where they were read Washington's farewell address that he gave to Congress before he resigned. And they made sure the cadets realized that you focus on the Union and what those men fought for. Later that same day, when the men were dismissed from chapel, they were marched back to their dorms, and the bands began to play Washington's March in honor of the day's events. Across the campus, some of the Southern cadets heard the music and the songs, and they began to sing a song out their window called Dixie. And at West Point, for hours, you had two groups of soldiers, cadets, singing their favorite ballad back and forth. Some Star Spangled Banner, the others singing Dixie. It was never obvious more that West Point was a divided school. Soon after, April 12th, 1861, the Confederates bombed Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, signaling the beginning of the American Civil War. This, too, was a West Point event. You see, the commander of Fort Sumter, Major Robert Anderson, at one point had taught at West Point, and a graduate himself. The commander of the Confederate forces opposing him, that's that man that said, "Jump, watch me, I'll jump." That's P.G.T. Beauregard, firing back at his old commander. It said he was in anguish to give the first opening shots because he knew he was firing on his cadet classmate. The day after the firing at Fort Sumter, the Secretary of War ordered that everyone at West Point take a new oath of allegiance. This hadn't been done before. A new oath. Officers and cadets at the point took oaths to their individual states. But in 1861, the rules were changed right in the middle of the game. They knew where we were heading. The oath was changed so that the cadets now swore to the United States, paramount to any other state or country or any other political entity whatsoever. It changed. Of the 278 cadets at West Point on the day that Lincoln was elected, 86 were appointed from the South. Out of that 86, 65 would resign and go home. Henry DuPont tells us again, quote, "I cannot look forward to graduation with the pleasure I once did formerly. And if it is to be our lot to be employed in cutting our countrymen's throats and fighting our dearest friends and classmates, then I will tell you I am very, very sorry I ever came here." End quote. Henry DuPont, 1861. Before they were sent off to war, the remaining cadets gathered at the old chapel. I love the old chapel because it's fascinating. And I go back into my Rev War time here about Major John Andre and Benedict Arnold, and Arnold wanted to give up West Point. If you've never been there, make sure you visit the chapel because you'll see Arnold's name. Arnold's name is supposed to be right there, but it was stripped off for what he did to give up West Point. They still get him back. These cadets, before they were dismissed, knew it was coming to an end, and everyone felt it. So in a really symbolic, sad event, they sang, "When Shall We Meet Again?" And there wasn't a dry eye on campus because they knew that was it. And they knew the next time they see each other, they very well may be opposing forces. With the outbreak of the war, the men in West Point faced different challenges depending on the cause and the side they fought on. Those who defended the Confederate cause had an enormous task of building an army from the ground up, from scratch. But the one thing they had were many West Point officers. In the Union, in the North, West Point officers were not appointed, or even it took time for them to make their impact. Political infighting and red tape kept many of the West Pointers from being appointed in the Union. I did this one 2 weeks ago, and somebody in the audience was very agitated that they used Washington on a Virginia recruiting poster. He's a Virginian. What got me annoyed was they actually used the crossword, the password for the crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night, victory or death. That was the counterside for Washington's troops, but they are equating themselves to the First Rebel Army. So the recruiting posters would be symbols of the Revolution. Matter of fact, both sides would use those same types of things. The West Pointers realized they were on two sides. Billy Yank and Johnny Reb, as they were called. It became difficult. When the men began to form and build an army, Jefferson Davis would become president of the Confederate States, and he would appoint many West Pointers into his army. The soldiers' lives, as you know, or if you don't know, were very not all battle. with a lot of downtime. That's why they played baseball and had some of the biggest snowball fights ever. And a lot of downtime. They drilled and they drilled and they drilled. But what came out of West Point were good soldiers who trained soldiers that could become good soldiers. Never more would this be obvious at the Battle of First Bull Run, where these soldiers were actually put into battle for the first time. So too put in the battle were the officers. The first Battle of Manassas was a foreshadowing of how bad things were to come. Remember, back in the book study under Dennis Mahan, they were taught tactics, not out on the field. So, for example, at the Battle of Bull Run, Sherman, Beauregard, and McDowell are all there. For 4 days before the Battle of Bull Run, Sherman is reading about how to maneuver men. 30 to 40,000 men at a time. Back at West Point, he wasn't trained for that. He'd never seen anything that size. West Point taught the men how to operate in the plains and the flat fields of Europe. Because who are they studying from? Napoleon. Napoleonic tactics, elbow to elbow on a field of battle, not in the wilderness of Virginia. And that's really what changes. So they have a very difficult time. And if you think the tactics were difficult, if anything is never more obvious at Bull Run, is all these officers, especially Beauregard, drew out these grandiose battle orders that nobody could read. Nobody knew what they meant. Even the subordinate officers had no idea what he was writing. They had to ask him, what are you writing here? We don't know how to follow it. It's first battle. Give them time. Sadly, they're going to get better. Across the enemy line, Irvin McDowell, another West Pointer. He also is reenacting Napoleon. The only trouble is you need Napoleon's army to reenact Napoleon. They don't have that. They have this 90-day wonder bunch of volunteers, an organized mob, 2 mobs. The Battle of Bull Run was a victory, if you could call it that, for the Confederacy, but for both sides, they realized they were in trouble. The spirit that bonded the men of West Point manifested itself throughout the war, the entire war throughout. Of the war's 60 major battles, 55 were commanded on both sides by West Point graduates. Both the Union and Confederate officers were products of the same instruction. That's maybe why it went 4 years toe-to-toe, because they were both so good. They followed the same rules. But as much as I've built up enemies and warfare and death, it takes a professionalism to be in that predicament and be in charge. And there are no 2 finer examples of what West Point could produce than Jackson's campaign, the Valley Campaign. It's an incredible feat. And he's going against his classmate, McClellan. The Shenandoah Valley Campaign of '62 is an absolute masterpiece of marching and counter-marching at top speed. Jackson's going against other armies, and he's outnumbered 4-1. And he turns it and he pulls it off, learning from Dennis Hart Mahan, the Grace West Point professor. Just as amazing is Sherman's march. Sherman also was student, a masterpiece of cohesion and logistics, always moving faster than his Confederate counterparts in an effort to break the South's will. He does it. Sherman does it. His army of 62,000 men swept from Atlanta to the sea through the Carolinas in the winter of 1864. The great thing about Sherman's army that most people don't realize or remember is Sherman is learning from West Point. He's using all kinds of what is then modern day improvements, signal poles for telegraph wires, technology that he did all back to his West Point training, pontoon bridges. He's learning engineering and all these things he does. But as dazzling as the examples are on the battlefield, for me, what really shines is the camaraderie that the men never lost. You see it time and time again throughout the war. This bond that they built at West Point, even though on 2 different sides, was always there. It starts at Fredericksburg. When Burnside was humiliated, the Confederates offered him, he was mourned by his Confederate counterparts for how much they beat him and his army at Fredericksburg. At Fort Donelson, when Grant captures General Simon Buckner, the first thing Grant does is he offers Buckner some of his money in case he needs it as a captured prisoner. Perhaps the most poignant event happened not far from where we are tonight in Adams County, Pennsylvania. July 3rd, the high water mark of Pickett's charge, when Confederate Loomis Armistead, leading his men over the hill, is wounded severely. His friend Hancock, Winfield Scott Hancock, was there. The men yards from each other, knew each other, maybe not knew how close they were, but Armistead and Hancock were that tight, that close. To the day, there's a monument for those two gentlemen at the battlefield. Mcclellan would say, quote, of Pickett, another relationship. George Pickett with his wife and Mcclellan. When Pickett got married, Pickett tried to explain it to his wife, this bond with this Yankee in blue. And he tells his wife, quote, he was and always will be, even if his pistol was pointed at my heart, my closest friend. You, my darling, cannot understand that, and I am sorry. We have an amazing bond. I call it an entente cordiale between us old fellows, end quote. Perhaps Mrs. Pickett had a better understanding of this relationship when she gave birth to their first son, Pickett, a Confederate, while Grant was besieging Richmond. Upon hearing the news of the birth, Grant honors his old friend by lighting huge bonfires in honor of the birth of Pickett's child. And just a few weeks later, Grant would get a silver service through the lines to Mrs. Pickett with an inscription on the silver, quote, to our friend and classmate George Pickett. It tells you how close these guys were. It's beautiful. Very, like I said, a very emotional program to put together, and I left so much on the edit floor. It's incredible. It's not all glory and honor. Here's one. Of course, Custer is involved. Upon capturing and being captured, Custer and Tom Rosser write letters complaining that their clothing is either too big or too little. So when Confederates captured Custer, Rosser writes a letter, you're too big, you're too tall, have your seamstress take in your clothing. I want to wear all your fancy stuff, all your leather. And then when Custer captures Rosser, it's the same thing, your stuff is too little. You need to grow some, just fun little back and forth comments. There's also another one about the story. Let me go back a second here. A great little story that is lost to us, but it's the story of Mcclellan and his future wife. The Confederates had a gentleman by the name of A.P. Hill. A.P. Hill sought the hand of a girl named Ellen Marcy, but she married George Mcclellan instead. A.P. Hill's a Confederate. She marries a Union soldier, Officer George Mcclellan. So anytime Mcclellan and Hill got together on the field of battle, anytime the armies got together, McClellan's men knew they were going to catch it bad. And there's a story where McClellan and his men are hunkered down in a trench, and here comes A.P. Hill's men, like for the 5th time. And one Union soldier yelled out loud, and they called McClellan Nellie. He yells out, "Oh my God, Nellie, why'd you have to go and marry her?" There are beautiful stories as well. Custer again is back. This is his friend, Confederate Major General Stephen Ramseur, who would be wounded mortally at Cedar Creek in 1864. Ramseur would be taken from the battlefield and taken to Phil Sheridan's headquarters, a Union officer. Sheridan and Custer would sit with Ramseur until the very end. As long as the man was conscious, they gave him their love that no one else at that time could give. But nowhere does the West Point spirit live more than what took place on April 9th, 1865. In the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house at Appomattox Courthouse, virtually all of the officers present were Union and Confederate West Point cadets at one point. It was a reunion. And to me, that's really where the spirit of West Point is summed up at the end when it's over, and there's clearly a loser. And I think what happens here at Appomattox begins the healing of where the country was going to go, that this terrible war was coming to an end and there was a permanent division. But among one thing West Point taught was that your enemy was your enemy until it was over, and then he was no longer your enemy. Unlike many soldiers in that war, Grant understood that the entire time, even right up to the end. And I think if you haven't thought about it before, have you ever thought about this? Lee may not have ever come in if it wasn't Grant, if it wasn't a West Pointer. You know, we could do that all day with history. What if? He may not have come in. He may have stayed in the field and fought that guerrilla tactic. But he knew it was Grant, and he knew we would get honorable terms. These two men met, they focused, and came to an agreement. Grant's men would give the Confederates rations, 5,000 rations, that Grant said, "Our men look a little starving. We need more rations," sending them through the line for the Confederates. They, ironically, were in the Meade room, I believe. Yes, okay, so here you go. Of course, when the surrender takes place, Meade is there, Longstreet's there, and when it was over, there was a relief. There was a shaking of hands, there was a pat on the back. Many of the men looked at Meade and said, "Wow, I can't believe how gray you have become." And Meade apparently looks back and says, "You all have to answer for that." The reuniting of the men was something beautiful. Many of the men lost their lives. Alonzo Cushing at Gettysburg. Did Alonzo Cushing even realize he was fighting his counterpart from West Point, Edward Portal Alexander, in the artillery battle? Just yards apart. That army of the Confederacy of the Northern Virginia was one heck of an army, and you could say West Point created it. Whether a bad thing or a good thing, it was that good of an army. But ultimately, it's the story of the men of West Point in the Civil War that grew that bond. The class of 1846 had a huge contribution. Many of them did not come home. The men of West Point shared these feelings and expressed the spirit throughout the war. Jesus said, "Love your enemies." And in the midst of that war, our most blackest, darkest 4 years, these men did that. And in the aftermath, the sons of West Point, in fact, did love their enemies. They were there for them at the end. They should be remembered in the context of that love. I view the classes now across the slumbering years. I see them with the flush of youth on their cheeks, and a mist gathers over my eyes as one passes on and on. Their faces come back into view. Oh, let the dew fall, and the stars shine softly where the dead now lie. And let that trumpet blow its last sound, and may the gates of heaven swing open to all of us. Morris Schaff. It's not so much what the men of West Point accomplished on the battlefield that deserves admiration. Rather, it's something more elusive, what they formed, what they created, something that cannot be reduced to dates and statistics and battles. Perhaps it can be traced to what they learned at West Point. They were inspired with an enduring set of ideals, a strong spirit, and a clear purpose of patriotism that transcended even the most bitter of conflicts. And it still inspires a large amount of us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was a great presentation. We have time for some questions.
Yeah, I want to thank you again for the invite. Any questions, please? Yes,
We have
ma'am.
one over here.
How much did the effect of the Mexican War have on the West Point classmates?
A huge amount of impact, considering many of the men that were officers in the Union Army would be veterans of the War of Mexico. They learned quite a bit. The problem there is you didn't have the soldiers around. The officers stayed on, but the soldiers did not. Many of the officers learned in the War with Mexico. That was a huge learning lesson to take it back to the laboratory of West Point, learn from it, study it, but a whole different type of enemy as well. But a huge impact, War with Mexico. Good question.
Question right here from Kerry.
Well, I was going to put this aside. This is a little bit picky because I don't think General Meade was at Appomattox Courthouse. I believe that his lung injury from Glen Mills was acting up and he was actually in an ambulance at the time?
You're correct. So it's the days following,
Okay,
the West Pointers continued to socialize in many different ways. And that was something that came up after the fact. I believe the name was Lee. I think it was Lee he was talking to. And he blamed Lee for that.
Actually then, Mike, since we talked about the Mexican War, what about the Crimean War? Did that have any effect militarily on the Civil War?
Tactics, for sure. You know what really has inspired the Crimean War would be the medical, another whole separate program maybe in the future. The Florence Nightingale was a real person, and they really studied from Florence Nightingale, Clara Barton, and Dorothea Dix, and many of the Union war effort. But again, once again, wars that were relatively in that time frame evolved and changed, and the Crimean War would be one that would be studied as well in the history classrooms. Good question.
Michael, you're just a couple of Civil War roundtables ahead of us. I think we have the medicine in the Civil War coming up, right? We're working on that.
We
on
are
that
indeed.
program.
Yep.
Yeah.
Other questions? I do have a question, Michael. So there's
Yes,
a commission that's looking at West Point and looking at names that are inscribed at West Point, notably Robert E. Lee Hall. What is your view of, and the commission just recently released a report to remove Lee and other Confederates in particular, and others, but that are honored at West Point. What's your view of that issue and that commission's preliminary reports as you understand them?
Yeah, the institution went throughout all, you've heard the stories of all the Army bases, that were named for Confederate generals, and the West Point has the big one, of course, with the plaque with a certain logo, and then Lee Gate and Lee Hall, which were given by donors, and that was the agreement, a monetary donation would get the name. I think we've changed, certainly as a country, that even our institutions could be looked at to possibly make a change if it's needed for those that now are there and studying in the future of our country to heal. I think it's the placement and where some of them are located. At an institution, you understand the military symbolism of it, and it's a debate. I'm sure West Point will do the right thing, and if they have to be moved, then keep them, but maybe in the museum, or put them. There's so many military museums on the Point where things could be still on display to remind us. I think that's important, remind us. So good question. Yeah, that debate is still hot and fresh. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Michael Jesberger. Michael, thank you again. We will see you October 3rd for Bob Woodson, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you again.